Hello everybody, this video is a continuation of the previous one on Middlegames. It is a sample blitz game actually that I played and have tried to remember as best I can, so it's not as good as a master game, but I hope it has some instructive value. It's going to be about playing on the other side of either a stone wall or a pawn chain that is very, very solid uh, and quite defensive in nature, and how you can break out. So in the game, I was black, and my opponent played d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, g3, which is a tad uncommon. Generally, c4 is played. So I played e6, bishop g2. So now, if if I say play bishop e7, c4 goes to a main line, sort of Catalan opening. But I don't really like main line, I like to mix it up a bit. So I played b5, preventing c4. And this is similar to the stone wall in that I'm putting lots of my pawns on light squares. And the trouble with some elements of the stone wall, which does run into problems for black, is that the pawn structure can become very fixed and unmoving, and white can then target your pawns. So being aware of that, my plan is to do what's called a pawn break, which you see in a lot of lines for black where white has a space advantage. So the Caracan and the French defense are good examples of pawn breaks, where you create tension in the center against white's pawn structure. So after white castled, knight bd7, bishop g5, c5. So I'm breaking with my pawn structure. I don't want all my pawns to be zigzagging on the light squares. I want to create some tension. c3. So if I capture, white will just recapture and have a slightly better pawn structure on the queen side. Bishop b7 may not be the best move, but I was on autopilot with this move, and I just thought fianchetto the bishop and counter any pressure white has along the long diagonal with his bishop on g2. a4 was played, so this is another pawn break where I've got three pawns on b5, c5, and d5 that are all pretty good in terms of structure. They're all side by side, and this move is trying to weaken my structure. If I play b takes a4, then white can recapture and have good development and a possible queenside majority. And also, I just don't really like the way my pawns would start to look. I'd have an isolated pawn on a7, which could be annoying. So I play a6, ready to recapture with the pawn. Knight a3 is played to attack b5 more. And now that the knight's come to a3, I do play b4. And there is a reason to this. If the knight goes back to b1, what I could do is I could completely restrict white's play by playing c4, and then maybe b3 or b takes c3, and my pawn structure is it's just in a long pawn chain from f7 down to c4 or b3, and it does restrict a lot of white's play on the queen side. And I don't think that white has much on the king side either, so I'm not too afraid of allowing white a free hand on the king side. He took, and I recaptured. Knight c2 was played, and now I don't want to disconnect the pawns and have the pawn on b4 stranded, so I played a5. Now technically I've got a backward pawn on a5, and white would have a backward pawn on b2 or b3, but my pawn chain goes from a5 to b4, and it's sort of pointing back towards the center, which is generally seen as being stronger than a pawn chain b3 to a4, which is sort of pointing away from the center. You want to have your pawn base far away on the edge, so it's not so easy to attack. Rook c1, bishop d6. So I'm getting ready to castle. Knight a1. So it looks like a terrible move, but hopefully you can see what white is planning next move. I play bishop a6. There's no point having it on b7. I'm just hitting thin air, hitting my own brick wall, so I may as well put it on a long diagonal. Knight b3. That was the point of knight a1, to reroute the knight and attack the base of my pawn chain on a5. It's defended by the queen though, so I castle. Queen d2. Queen b6. Takes, and knight e5. So already, I want to just pause here and let you have a look at the position more. So, what are the positives for white in this position? All right. Well, white has a good knight on e5. It's you could say infiltrated my position. It's in my half of the board, hitting a lot of light squares and putting pressure on me, possibly a cramping influence as well. The other knight is safe and targeting some dark squares on the queen side, ready to come into c5 at a moment's notice. Could be quite strong. Especially also the rook on the c file is very, very useful, and c6 is a real danger here. Rook to c6 could be very, very strong. And what white is doing is trying to capitalize on my weaknesses, which is weak squares on the c-file mostly. c4 and c3 are pretty well under guard, but c5 and c6 are weakened. And I'm reminded of a Bobby Fischer quote that it's often attributed to Bobby Fischer at least, which is you have to lose control of squares in order to gain squares, or you've got to give squares to gain squares. So what I've done is I'm controlling c4 and c3, at least partially with my pieces, but I'm somewhat surrendering control of squares in my half of the board. But my argument here is that I am fighting for the space advantage. So admittedly, some of my squares in my half will be weakened, but I'm trying to create lots of activity and focus all the attention on white's half of the board, where my weaknesses don't matter so much. White's negatives are that the rook on the f-file doesn't have anywhere to go, it just has to wait to come to the c-file. Not really much of a weakness, but the bishop on g2 could be said to be weak, because it's just hitting a brick wall again on d5. My pluses are I've got the two bishops, so if the game opens up, I've got a lot of potential advantage in that the two bishops control lots of squares and can target and coordinate very well with each other. And my queen is quite active, it's defending and attacking. My knight on f6 can come to e4 later. And I've also got my rooks, which are coming onto the c-file as well. So after rook ac8, white actually took. And I think he thought that it would be easier for me to build up on the c-file with my rooks than it would be for him. So the rooks transfer to the c-file. And here I actually take now. I'm the one doing the exchanging. Because after knight takes, because if queen takes c1, the e2 pawn is dropping, so bishop takes e2 could be very good here. Although I'm not sure I would have played it, because queen c8 and then bishop f8 could potentially cause me a couple of problems, maybe a small headache over defending. But it was a blitz game, so what do I know? Maybe I'd have just snapped off the pawn. But he took with the knight. I played queen c7, so I'm targeting both knights here, trying to put pressure on him and gain the c-file. Knight cd3, knight e4. So here he could have taken, but then my pawn is again cramping white's play, and I could potentially win a pawn here after the knight on d3 would move, and then I could take twice on... oh no, I couldn't, no, scratch that. But anyway, after the knight on d3 moved, I could potentially gain more space and do quite well. So he played queen c1. and I then immediately take here. Perhaps slightly better is bishop takes d3, but I wasn't convinced. I just thought take the knight, have white capture with the pawn, because if queen takes queen, I take with the bishop, and I'm a piece up. And if knight takes bishop, he has a queen that's on freeze, so I can just take a queen. So pawn takes, queen takes, knight takes. And now I've got a slightly better pawn structure, partly due to my original pawn break on c5 and having a fairly good fluid pawn structure. And now his pieces are quite passive, so I attack the a4 pawn. He has to defend it with b3. And now I actually sacrificed. I didn't really calculate this all the way to the end, but I thought that after he took, which he did, and I recapture, his bishop on g2 is still sort of locked out. It can't come to e4 or d5, for example. And 2 pawns against a knight is probably going to win when the pawns are this far advanced. So e3 was played. He's trying to create a way for his bishop to maneuver to the queen side. c3, bishop f1, b3, and now b2 would be very unpleasant and practically winning. So he takes and I take, bishop d3 to stop c2, and then I played a move here which he resigned, but then we played on a couple of moves just to have a laugh. But what move do you think caused resignation here? Well, it's a move that's already been played in this position just by the opposing side, knight a1. So I'm planning on c2. So for example, after king f1, c2, bishop takes, knight takes. And here what I can do is, because his pawns, even though he's got an extra pawn, if I just leave my pawn structure intact without me even moving any pawns, he can't actually create a passed pawn with 5 against 4 on the king side. So all I need to do is just play king f8, king e7, king d7, king c6, and march in and invade with my king. And I don't think he really has any chance of stopping me executing this plan. So yeah, he resigned in this position, or a few moves earlier. And just going back to the start, what I want to impress upon you is that after the opening moves here, the reason I played b5 was to prevent c4, so I'm actively taking action to prevent my opponent's plans. After another move or so, I then see that if I'm not careful, he might play a move that could fix my pawn structure down, maybe knight d2 to b3, for example. And also, I don't like having backward pawns. They often feel weak, and they often prove to be as well. So when you're trying to play something like the Stonewall Dutch, or even the Caracan or the French defence, be very aware of the pawn breaks. In the French, you have c5 to attack white's structure on d4, and you also have f6, which can be played. And in the Caracan main lines, what can often be played is c5 or e5 to push the pawn forward, gain a little space for your pieces, and also attack white's structure and create tension as well, which is useful in trying to gain an initiative or at least reduce white's initiative. So I do play c5, and white is sort of forced onto the defensive with c3. He doesn't want to give up a centre pawn. And this allowed me room to maneuver and actually, I think, gain an initiative and be better after a5 here, because I've got a pawn in his half of the board. His knight on c2 is very restricted. It's hard to move around much. My bishop on f8 has lots of squares that are under its influence. The bishop on b7 can be transferred to a6, which I do. I don't really need to have castled in this position, because one of the main features of having an uncastled king is that it can become very weak if the centre is opened up. But because of my pawn chain f7, e6, d5, White's going to have to wait a very long time before he can open up the centre of the board and make my king weak. So I didn't need to play brilliant Magnus Carlsen level style chess, and calculate everything perfectly. I just had to improve the pieces. I've just improved the 2 bishops. Then only then I need to castle, really, and that's just to get my rook into play. Connect the rooks, and then activate the rooks. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and got something out of it. Any comments or questions, feel free to put them. I'll try and respond or take on the feedback. And hopefully like and subscribe to this video. All right, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.